I'm very excited to welcome in someone who, wow, his predictions when he puts on the Katz prediction hat, very strong. He predicted a guilty verdict in the Trump case after first feeling as though there wouldn't be a guilty verdict. He rapidly pivoted after seeing the way that the prosecutors put that case on. He, a former federal prosecutor himself, now he works the defense side of the table. And I want to talk about everything going on in Florida, in Georgia, and with the justice system seeming to enable Trump and a lot of these legal misdeeds. He is David Katz, everybody. Hi,
Great
David.
to be with you, Mark. Tim.
Wow. Well, for starters, I guess I must ask you what's happening with Georgia. I mean, there appears to be this pretty, I thought, compelling case against Donald Trump. You have him on tape and in recorded conversations talking about trying to get additional votes in Georgia. And that's just one of the things. I mean, there are also a bunch of other corroborative conversations and actions. But now that case is parked?
Well, yes. And I guess the only good thing that can be said about it is that this case, I didn't think was that likely to go to a jury verdict before the November election anyway. If you'll recall, this is the racketeering case, which has all of these defendants in it. It seemed like a very unwieldy trial to try to prove a racketeering violation against all of them. And that could have been a 5 or 6 month trial. So the idea that it would have ended up in a verdict. Now, yes, some of the presentation of evidence would have been embarrassing to Trump, would have been very incriminating. Of course, a lot of that came out during the January 6 hearings in Congress. I mean, if people want to pay attention to it, there's an awful lot to pay attention to. The phone call, this is the notorious one where Trump is actually taped by the Secretary of State, which he doesn't expect. So Trump thinks this is going to be a private conversation that's just going to be his word against their word. But it's taped, and that's the one where he says, hey, all I need are 11,000 votes. Find me 11,000 votes. And the way he says find me in the whole context, he means concoct me. So that's a great piece of evidence. There's other great evidence. But it didn't look like that case was going to go to trial anyway. But now for sure, it's not going to go to trial. And I have some misgivings about what the Georgia appellate court did there, and I can get into them if you'd like to.
Well, I'd like to ask you about why. I mean, I wonder if you could explain why it's not going. In other words, why they parked it, and then you can talk about misgivings, if you would, please.
Well, there is something called an interlocutory appeal. And so you don't have to wait for the final judgment and complain about all the things that you say that the trial judge did wrong if you're a defendant, as Trump is. But there are very few exceptions to the idea that you have to wait until the end of the trial. You just have to take your lumps. And then if there's really been a not harmless error, then you normally get the remedy of a new trial without the error that was harmful to you that was made during the previous trial, the one that you complained to the Court of Appeals about at the end of all the motions, all the trial, all the sentencing. They've allowed this interlocutory appeal where he says you need to stop everything right now and decide this issue of whether Fani Willis should have been completely taken off the case along with her office or not. And the reason that I have misgivings is this looks like regularity. This doesn't look like anything odd happened. They had evidentiary hearings. The whole country saw them. She testified. Her boyfriend testified. The judge made what looked to me like a very reasoned decision, that there was not an actual conflict of interest. There were really bad optics and really poor judgment, but there was not an actual conflict of interest. This is not like some situations that you can imagine. She also supposedly expressed an extrajudicial opinion, Mark, that she spoke at a church and she supposedly said things about the case. Well, I mean, every press release, every client that I've represented in a high profile case has a press release that says, well, he's presumed innocent. And then they go on chapter and verse about why he's guilty and should be convicted and everything else. So I don't see that as a substantial issue that she spoke at that church, that she tainted the jury pool. Oh, come on. They found a non-tainted jury pool in New York City for Trump. They can find a non-tainted jury pool down in Fulton County. So that hit me as a very insubstantial issue. So the issue is whether she had this actual conflict of interest. There were evidentiary hearings. The whole country heard it. The judge, who I think is a Republican or was supported by Republicans, McAfee, who seemed terrific, he heard it and he said, as long as the conflicted attorney, special prosecutor, is off the case, and he got off the case. You, Fani Willis, while you exercised poor judgment, did not have an actual conflict of interest. You can stay on the case. The idea that the whole trial has to now be stopped, that all the motions hearings have to be stopped, I think that was really kind of extraordinary because, as I said, it looked like regularity. And if the prosecutor wanted to go ahead, which the prosecutor did, that office was taking the risk that at the end it would all be thrown out. That under the final judgment rule, when Trump complained about everything that he said they'd done wrong and all the lumps he'd had to take, this issue, if it's a winner, that he had a prosecutor against him with an actual conflict of interest in the case, he would get a new trial. He'd get new motions. So this seemed to me like another stall that some appellate court either fell for or wanted to see happen because of their own political leanings. And let me say one last thing, too. One of the problems in that case is that Trump does not stand alone. I understand you want to work up from the other ones, okay? But Jack Smith was very smart in a case which is sort of related. I mean, the case in Washington, D.C. about January 6th is this as it applied to the whole country. The case in Atlanta is this as it applied to Georgia, right? He picked Trump alone. If she had picked Trump alone for this charge down there, right now a court could have said, you know what, we see this storm coming. Trump, you've got lots of lawyers and lots of money. Georgia DA's office, you do too. You're going to see one of the most expedited schedules in the world. And let me say this. Remember when it was Bush v. Gore? Somehow the United States Supreme Court managed to get on their horse in weeks. Why can't the Georgia appellate court get on its horse in weeks and tell Trump, with all of your lawyers and all your money, you file your brief in a week? And you, the DA's office, you file your reply in a week. We'll hear it then and we'll decide it. If they're right, yes, they have to start with a new prosecutor. But if they're wrong, this has really been a miscarriage of justice because they have punted this whole thing well beyond the November election. And it matters whether it's decided before the November election. Are they the only, those three judges on that panel, Mark, are they the only three people in America who don't know that it matters that there be a decision before the November election?
So, in view of what you just said, then those judges to which you've referred or to whom you've referred, they sadly, this is underpinning it, maybe not just the law, but political, a political agenda.
I don't know their political leanings, and I'm hoping at this point that they can still go to the Georgia Supreme Court and say, look, let's move forward with this case. And if Trump and his other defendants are right, then it'll all get thrown out. It won't be a verdict that's going to stand up, a conviction that's going to stand up because she had an actual conflict of interest. But if they don't want it decided right now, and they don't, the prosecution wants it decided at the end of the case like everything else, they're taking the risk, aren't they, Mark? They're taking the risk that it all gets thrown out. But this stops, as I say, this is just a punt. And I don't know their political leanings. It'd be interesting if maybe someone who is in your audience could figure out what party, what their political leanings are. But I just don't like this decision. I hope it goes to the Georgia Supreme Court and the Georgia Supreme Court says, no, the stay is lifted. You can go ahead with everything. I still don't think it would get to a verdict. Mark, if the trial started in 2 weeks, how would it get, and it's a 5 or 6 month trial, how does it get to verdicts like the case in New York that got to guilty felony verdicts? How does it get to guilty felony verdicts if the trial is going to take 5 to 6 months? Look at the calendar.
Sure, it doesn't. And so to Florida quickly, because there is a Trump judge who makes the Georgia appeal look quaint. She is leading the MAGA parade, clearly. These judgments, I'm wondering if you could put them in some kind of context. The latest delay opens up a hearing to those who are not even involved in this entire legal process right now on the legitimacy of the Jack Smith indictment. Can you speak to this?
You know, Mark, we used to give her the nickname Loose Cannon, but that's really unfair to the facts because she's tightly focused cannon in support of Trump, it looks like. On this particular one, and she's made some outrageous decisions, and she slowed this case down. She was reversed right off the bat by the 11th Circuit, full of Trump appointees. They reversed her, not once but twice, as to the search at Mar-a-Lago. It's a slam dunk case. It's another one that is never going to see the light of a trial courtroom before the November election. On this particular one, though, she wasn't out of line, Mark. Here's why she wasn't out of line on this one. Courts are allowed to receive amicus briefs. The U.S. Supreme Court has a whole business of there's people in Washington. That's all they do at law firms is write amicus briefs in Supreme Court and other high-profile appellate cases, right? And so they wrote these amicus briefs, and then
And just to be clear, David, that's like friend of the court briefs from those who are not. Is that what that means? Amicus briefs?
they're unsolicited, but someone like the firearms lobbies law firm says, look, we want to express our opinion about the Second Amendment. And we're worried that it won't be expressed by the parties exactly the way we want. So here's exactly what our argument is. A court can accept it or reject it, but the U.S. Supreme Court has got in the habit, Mark, of taking those briefs. And as I say, there's a whole cottage industry of writing those amicus briefs and saying, here's how the ACLU feels. Here's how these certain law professors feel. Lawrence Tribe is always filing them. He's a Harvard law professor. This is the kind of thing that they do. And it's not unusual that they would file amicus briefs in her court. It's a little unusual in district court, but in important cases, remember the case in Amarillo, Texas, where they were going to ban the use of the medical abortion pill throughout the United States? People who didn't think that was a good idea said, I know the Department of Justice is going to express their opinion, but we, Planned Parenthood, we want to express our opinion in amicus brief. So she's got these amicus briefs, and she's entitled to receive them. She's entitled to read them. So she reads them, and she says, I have some questions about it. It would be useful to me in making this decision to give a half an hour. She gave a half an hour to two people on Trump's side of the question who say that the special prosecutor is not properly appointed, and one who says that the special prosecutor was properly appointed, and here's why. Now, you might think, well, Trump and the special prosecutor are going to fully brief and explain that issue. But there is this tradition of having these amicus briefs. And once you have the brief, you want to hear from the people. The argument, here's the other reason why Jack Smith was off base, did not use good judgment in bringing this case in the District of Florida. Not only did he have a 1 in 3 chance of getting Cannon, who he got, but the law that's been made on these issues of the special prosecutor has mainly been made in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. Circuit. That law that they've made, that these appointments are totally proper, do not apply in Florida. They don't apply. It's a different circuit. The only cases that bind Cannon are cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. All of these precedents that have been decided by the D.C. Circuit would have applied if Jack Smith had brought the case in the D.C. Circuit, but they don't apply here. So it's not that outrageous that she says, I'm making new law in the 11th Circuit. I want to hear from these 3 experts. The argument on the merits, I think, is a loser. And I think that she will come to the conclusion that they are losers. The idea is that he shouldn't have appointed somebody. Jack Smith shouldn't have been appointed because he was someone out of the government. That's insubstantial. Now, if you picked a lawyer, you take a lawyer out of the phone book and say, okay, I'm making you the special prosecutor. First of all, you can do that under the law. Secondly, Jack Smith was hardly picked out of the phone book. He's a former Department of Justice attorney, very accomplished. He was on the World Court doing things over there. So that's not substantial. And then the other idea is that you just can't have a special prosecutor in this situation. You cannot imbue somebody like that with so much power. And I think those issues, I haven't followed them totally closely, but I think those issues have been decided not only by the DC Circuit, but by the US Supreme Court. And that's why some people think that she's just wasting time, because most of these issues, it's so clear how they're going to come out that Jack Smith was properly appointed and can proceed with this case.
So to review then, as crazy as we may have felt it landed with us, the process that she has begun is not crazy in your judgment. In fact, it's actually, there's a lot of precedent for it. But the crazy part of the Florida case, which is clearly not going to see the light of day, is associated with all the other decisions that she's made leading up to this. For example, the access to the national security documents that are a big part of this case. She's made, I count like 3 different things that she's done that seem sort of way out of bounds and clearly in the tank for Trump. Those are the things you have issue with. Is that it?
Those are the things I have issues with. As I said, the 11th Circuit, even though it was full of Trump-picked appellate judges, had huge issues with how she sort of interfered with the litigant. Remember, she was going to have a special prosecutor. She was going to have somebody from outside the government look at all of the documents before the FBI could look at them. And so this is of a piece. What she's doing right now, while it makes sense in its own terms, people see it, of course, as of a piece with the fact that she always seems to pick the avenue that slows the case down the most, over and over again. But this particular one, well, it sounds a little nutty to people who aren't used to these amicus briefs being filed. And what are all these, I think that you said, why does she hear from these random people? And of course, it looks really odd because, who are these random people? It's like you had a case, I'm defending somebody and somebody says, I want to be heard. There's a really substantial issue in Mr. Katz's case and Mr. Katz may not bring it out or the government may not bring it out. I want to elucidate you, Your Honor. It sounds very, very strange. But this is a high profile issue. People do have opinions. These are some law professors who write about this topic. As I said, I just tried to explain it. They could explain it better than me. And she wants her half an hour colloquy with them to say, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Have you thought about this precedent? And she's not going to be reversed on this, on having this hearing, on having these people. This is actually sort of par for the course. But again, Mark, people look at it and they say, why does every single one of her decisions seem to take more time? It's not just an hour and a half to hear from these three amicus lawyers. It's not that hour and a half. It's the weeks, the months. Sure. And for her to say some of the things she says, like, how could the case go to trial? There are so many undecided motions. You didn't decide them. I mean, it's like, right, who caused this problem? Why are there so many problems in this case? Well, if you'd have ruled on these issues, there wouldn't be so many issues pending in the case. To say the case needs to be delayed and delayed because the issues have not been decided. It's like Iraq. Mistakes were made. No, mistakes were not made. Bush, Cheney, and that gang made a huge number of mistakes. So how did all these problems arise in this case? You created these problems, Judge Cannon. They can't say that to her. They can't say that to her, Mark.
Sure, but everything is in service of delay is the point. And exactly. This is yet one more thing that's in service. And this is, we visited this before, but I'm glad that Eileen, who's a big supporter of the show, writes, why did Jack Smith pick Florida over D.C.? And we've talked about that before, but it's worth a revisit because you wouldn't be in this situation if this case were being tried in D.C.
Let me revisit it quickly. There were two people whose acts you could argue only happened in Florida, and that was either the two minions of Trump, the two people who worked around Mar-a-Lago. So they would have argued that their case should have been severed and moved to the place where they were venue. That is not a substantial argument. If there's some conceivable venue for your case in some place, and there's a co-defendant that you're properly joined with, and their case is there. On top of that, even they didn't have that argument for a change of venue, Mark, because they knew that this had something to do with what Washington was investigating. They didn't think this was an investigation out of Tallahassee or the state. They knew this was the FBI. It was a federal investigation. It was about Trump being president. Where was he president? Washington, D.C. Where's the FBI? Washington, D.C. Those two didn't have substantial arguments. And Trump would have lost the motion if he had moved for change of venue. And we talked about this at the time. He wouldn't have had any appellate authority to rest his hat on. It is totally within the discretion where the government files. We defense attorneys yell about this. They often file in a very inconvenient place. And we're the one have to go to the inconvenient place and tell that judge, Your Honor, it would be much more convenient somewhere else. And if that judge rules against it and says, no, I'm going to keep it here, there's no appellate cases, at least the last time I researched it a few years ago, that gives us any ground to get the case moved. And that's what Trump would have found himself in. He would have found himself with a case in Washington, D.C., a judge in federal court in Washington, D.C., making his argument that the Mar-a-Lago case should be sent down there. And he would have faced the counter argument that you knew you got a subpoena for these records from Washington, D.C. You knew that you were being contacted from Washington, D.C. It's alleged that you took all the documents in the first place that you weren't entitled to from Washington, D.C. And I use this example. If he had moved to Paris, the idea that there would have only been venue of his case in France is ridiculous. There would have been venue of his case in Washington, D.C. because he got the subpoena from Washington, D.C. and he took the documents allegedly from Washington, D.C. I think it's more than alleged. I think everyone agrees that he took the documents from Washington, D.C. He's just got all these crazy theories, after the fact theories of, he declassified them. He dreamed about declassifying them, which was enough to declassify them. I mean, this is the totally frivolous Trump playbook.
I'm about to leave Trump land and get to another legal question that is super important. But before I do, I want to make sure I haven't left anything out. Sentencing begins July 11th in the Trump case. The gag order violations, they can be tacked on then. I just want to get it for the record, don't think that you said at least, and we have a very popular, it's been seen by tens of thousands of people in the first couple of hours, short out which essentially does a reducto on what you were talking about, which was that 70% of those without prior records who would be tried and convicted the way Trump was, they wouldn't do time. They get probation, and you think he'll likely get probation. So what is stacked on top of that probation, David, to allow for the gag order violations?
I don't think that he's going to be sent to a jail for any of it. And I think that the judge is wise. I actually saw your great interview with David K. Johnston 2 days ago. And I thought that he was, passionate in arguing why Trump ought to go to jail in this case. And I agree that he ought to go to jail in this case. To say that his case is like the 70% of people who've been prosecuted and don't go to jail because it was a nonviolent offense and it was a long time ago misses the whole point. This was about stealing the election, which he successfully stole. The gravity of the harm to the public was immense, and he knew it would be immense. And this was 2 weeks before the election. And after the Access Hollywood tape, it was very clear what his motive was. And his motive was to suppress her testimony lest he properly lose the election, because the electorate would have been properly informed and they would have voted against him and not for him. And if you look at it in that context, the problem is when you look at it in that context, that is the most polarizing way. That's the one that drives people crazy. And what's really going to happen? He's going to lock him up 3 days before unless he gets bail pending appeal, he's going to not show up at the Republican National Convention where he'll be nominated as a Republican nominee to be president. It's just not happening. He's not going to be sent to jail in this case. Now, whether he should be sent to home detention, where would the home detention be, Mark? In Trump Tower? At Mar-a-Lago? I think, did David say he'd love home detention at Mar-a-Lago? He played golf
exactly.
all day
He said
long.
if it's home detention, he hopes that it's Trump Tower and not Mar-a-Lago, is what David said.
He sent out all of his vicious, a slime that he does to all of his opponents and everybody else from his room at Mar-a-Lago. He played golf all day long, and he told the whole world, "I can't campaign. This is the deep state has me pinned down again. They pinned me down in the courtroom." So how does any of this make sense? And I know people say that if it were you or me, we would get locked up. And that's absolutely true. If it were you or me, believe me, we never would have made those statements in violation of the gag order, because any person who has any sense of self-preservation knows you don't sit there and attack the judge. I saw another show where they have a transcript of someone who says, judge says, "I'm going to give you a year and a half." And he says, "You're corrupt. You're awful. You're the worst judge in America. What, should I give you 2.5 years? Go do it, Your Honor. Go do it, Your Honor. You're corrupt. You're awful." And the judge actually raises the sentence, And I guess the idea is that Trump is not that guy. Trump is not doing it that irrationally. Trump thinks that there's a rational political goal, and that's where he's going. And the idea that this judge, Marchand, who so far has shown himself to be brilliant and, self-effacing, and knows how, I only disagreed with a couple of rulings in the whole case, Mark. I didn't agree with the fact that he made him stay there in the courtroom. I think he said to him, "You go anywhere you want to, you campaign anywhere you want to. The last thing I want to do is to interfere with your campaign. You are presumed innocent." And that's,
But David, but I don't mean to, and just to
argue
push
me
back.
again. I know you always argue me on this point, that it holds him above the law. Okay, but here's the reality: Trump would have been there almost every day anyway, because he wanted to confront the witnesses. And yes, he would have had some different talking point, but that talking point had a little bit of zing to see him pinned down there. And you think to yourself, wow, in Southern Texas, they charge Biden, and Biden is pinned down in the courtroom for 6 weeks, and everyone's talking about, did he have a bodily function in the courtroom? And you say to yourself, wow, if the shoe were on the other foot, this is a bad road that we're going down.
That's a very compelling argument that you have mentioned before, and it does stop me cold, because it's a great argument. I see why you're an effective attorney and a defense lawyer that I want on my side. It's just, as so many of us struggle to reckon or to square, maybe, might be a better way to put it, the idea that Donald Trump just gets away with everything he wants, and the legal system, which has surrounded him with all of these things where he's really dead to rights, somehow he gets out. It's like, it's like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. And so when you get to something like you have to show up in court every day, it's like, yeah, you have to show up in court every day because that's what an American has to do. I mean, in your situation. You're suggesting, but he's not just a normal American.
Mark, in federal court, you can waive your appearance. And that's actually fairly common. You can waive your appearance during the trial.
But this wasn't federal court.
A rational person would want to be there and would want the jury to see how much you care about the case. But you can waive your appearance even for trial, And so, so given that, and I know New York has its peculiarities, but ask yourself this: if he had said, "I know New York has this rule, I'm waiving it. I don't hear any complaints, anyone complaining," and if the government was smart, the DA's office was smart, they wouldn't have complained. So how is it ever going to be overturned? If the judge had done that and said, "This is an exceptional situation in the middle of a campaign, you're the presumptive Republican nominee," blah, blah, blah. And as I say, Trump would have been there just about every day anyway. You think he really wanted to go to his son's graduation more than he wanted to confront Michael Cohen
Well,
in the courtroom?
maybe not. I mean, maybe not. On that one, you and I might part company because it's a pretty brutal environment. He gets tired of it. He's able to throw those fastballs on the stump just as well and perhaps more effectively and on a kind of a pace that he wants, where he doesn't have to start the day until noon or whatever it may be when he's out and not having to show up to court. But I want to move on. Let's leave Trump behind for a moment. We can certainly circle back around to it with whatever seconds we have left. But I do want to ask you about the super important and gargantuan executive order that was signed by President Biden regarding the southern border. Can you speak to this legally, and where does this leave so many who are seeking asylum in this country? This is something that is being litigated immediately. We talked about it when the news broke. I said, wow, this is going to be tied up in the courts. And you can speak about some of the reasons why and how it might all be adjudicated.
Well, Mark, I try to be not right, not left, just right, not wrong. And this is a very controversial issue. But when you look at it legally, and a lot of people probably won't like my remarks, but that's just the way it is. The law actually says that people coming into the country, if they're going to make an asylum application, should do it from custody. The reality is that the law looks like we should have detention centers. That would be extremely controversial to have detention centers. Why would Biden want to be, Trump wanted to be the guy who was perceived as building more detention centers and holding places to hold these aliens, let them make their asylum applications, but let them make them either in Mexico or if they cross the border in one of these detention facilities. And then Trump, of course, separated families, and he made all of his, boorish and worse than boorish, racist, anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic remarks. And so he put a stink on everything. But the law is that they're supposed to wait in these detention facilities. Now, what the Biden administration did is we don't have enough detention facilities. We can't catch all these people. So what we'll do is we'll parole them into the United States. And they have a right, Mark, to parole them into the United States on a case-by-case basis. It's obvious it was not done on a case-by-case basis. It became an actual mass, as the New York Post calls it, mass amnesty program. Now, people will go crazy, but it is a mass amnesty program when thousands and thousands of people a day don't try to sneak in. They run right over to a U.S. official and they tell them, I want asylum. And they're given a date to go to court, or their name is put into a computer, and then here they are. And then these NGOs were good enough to help them. Of course you want to help them. They're human beings. So they took them to shelters, they took them, and they were totally overcrowded. There was no budget because the Republicans won't cooperate in this process. So there was no budget. And then these Republican governors put them on buses. And, it's kind of like call your bluff. Hey, in New York City and Martha's Vineyard, you're so concerned about these people. Good. Here's a busload of them. Here's a plane load of them. And that didn't turn out well. And then people in New York and Chicago and Denver got worried that, hey, wait a second, maybe they'll raise taxes and everybody will get everyone will get the whole pie they used to get, but maybe they won't raise taxes. And maybe they'll take 10% of my pie that I need for my rent subsidy, or I need for this payment or that payment from the government, and they'll spend it on the people who just came into the US. And those turned out to be tens and tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. So even in New York and Chicago, liberal mayors said, enough, you have to stop this. They complained with Biden. And now Biden, has done something about it. He's going to get incredible pushback from the left. They're going to quote where he said, you have a right to come to America, to be here and ask for asylum. But it became an utterly unsustainable system. And the last thing I want to say is a lot of people have doubts whether, at least under the asylum model, this is who they had in mind. The asylum model that passed Congress, rightly or wrongly, had in mind the refugees from Nazi Germany, of whom my father was one. And you can say that, if you're getting killed in these countries one way or the other, you're suffering the same fate of death as as the victims of Nazi persecution, right, and the Holocaust suffered. But you just say to yourself, like Turkey, people come here from Turkey and they ask for asylum. Is this really our view of Turkey, Mark? That it's a country where everyone's rights are violated, and so a person coming here is being persecuted. It's also just too many people, Mark. That's what, if you talk to people like, not if you just talk to them like informally, like I'm a swimmer at the pool, or just in a bar, you're just chatting with someone about this. They just say, I don't know all the legalities. I don't know exactly what happened, but it's too many people. Biden had to find a way to deal with the fact it was just too many people all coming at the same time. And now he's found a way to kind of deal with that. Trump will say, ha ha, told you so. And I think Biden's answer is, I'm the president. I solve problems. This became too much of a problem and I solved it. Well, when have you ever solved a problem? I think at the debate, he'll say, Trump, when have you ever solved a problem? When have you ever said that you were going in a wrong-headed direction and been big enough to say, you know what, I'm going to change my policy view? You just double down, triple down, and when you make a mistake, when you're in a hole, you keep digging. I'm not the guy who, when I'm in a hole, I keep digging. We had to dig ourselves out of this hole, and I came up with a policy. Now, whether the courts will go for it, I think Biden puts himself in a good position. If Trump judges rule against this program, saying, well, there's a right to ask for asylum, these people are being denied their rights under U.S. law, under international law to ask for asylum. It's terrible how Biden is not treating these immigrants who are flooding into the country properly. I don't think that's bad for Biden in the election if he gets that kind of ruling. If he gets a ruling that affirms him and affirms what he did, that's good. Those cases will go through the appellate courts. But I think Biden's advisors told him, you have to do this. You have to do something like this. And he was getting ready for the debate. This will be a big issue at the debate. I never thought immigration was going to be this big an issue, but here we are, 3 elections in a row.
Well, I mean, we have the same crisis at the border that many other countries have. I mean, Europe is facing with the same thing. And, you add the climate chaos to all of this, and you have people mass migrating across the world in much more aggressive and bigger numbers than much more aggressive ways and bigger numbers. And they're willing to go to greater and greater lengths to get, some kind of high ground, literally often.
But Mark, no matter how bad that is, and assuming it's worse, it's getting worse all the time and it's terrible, you just can't expect the voters to vote in favor of millions and millions of people coming here. Whatever the problems are in these other countries, you just cannot expect the voters to tolerate millions and millions of people coming here, basically unvetted. Yes, their name is put into a computer. Very few of them turn out to be criminals. I think almost all of them are economic or climate refugees. Are they political refugees in the sense that the statute thought about? I guess we're going to find out.
Well, that's one statute, right, David? That this is what's interesting is the reality is you can petition for asylum based on political persecution, but if you are in fear of your life in many other ways, you can come to this country and achieve an asylee status, can't you?
You can, but it just seems to always be expanding. I'm going to totally antagonize some of your audience, but one of them is domestic violence.
Right.
You're the victim of domestic violence, but think about the world. Think about the sexist, cruddy world that we live in, country by country, machismo, all these, male-dominated societies. How many people are we talking about who have a credible claim that they've suffered domestic violence? And again, are the voters willing to accept that number of people? Or will they say to a pollster, yeah, of course, domestic violence, yeah, we should let the person into the country, and then they vote for Trump? Because at the end of the day, they don't want the number of people that philosophy ends up producing crossing our borders.
Right. If you broaden the qualifications for asylum far enough, as you say, it does include domestic violence. It include you. If you claim that there's, forget about this political persecution thing. The number of people who are actually being politically persecuted, that's a small percentage. I mean, people are running from gangs and militias and from street violence and from all of these things that do exist in large numbers across Latin America and beyond. But you're right. There are many more qualifiers, that is to say, ways that you can qualify for asylum. But the reality is that asylum trial, this is the last thing, David, that may be years off from when you actually enter the country, right?
Yes. One solution would have been you have to ask at an American consulate outside the country. But we are going to increase tenfold the number of consular officials. I mean, what young person who likes international politics, law, whatever they've studied, who wouldn't love to be that customs official? You're sent to Mexico City. how exciting, you're bilingual, you sent this place, that place. And we could process 10 times as many people. But the answer is you do not ask for asylum from within the United States. You have to ask from outside. You don't get to cross the border, run over to an agent in the hundreds of thousands and say, I'm seeking asylum. And then you get a hearing 6 years down the road. And then you stay in America effectively for those 6 years. If you ever have a hearing, if they ever proceed with the hearing, if you go to the hearing. But of course, the Republicans talk a good game, but did they ever spend the money? Did they ever say, let's spend 10 times as much? Let's agree on that. So we have consular officials all over the world so they can take these applications. And so the good ones get granted. The people who really deserve asylum get granted. And the ones who don't get granted, because we can't take all the people in the world who want to come to America. And anyone who says that we can, and I've met people like that, that's a path to a new Trump presidency. That is not a path. That is not a winning path for Biden to take any of those views. And he's got to tell the left, if you want to bring Trump on, okay, yeah, fight me really hard. Say you're not going to vote for me because you're going to produce another Trump presidency.
Thank you for your dedication, says Ricky O'Bear one, to our country's laws, David, and your true insight into our situation. Isn't the current asylum system essentially the equivalent of having an open border? Is that where we're headed with all of this? Well, that's kind of what David is saying, Randy. And I mean, this is why Biden has stepped up the way he has. There was Motor X asking how come United Nations refugee camps can't be set up south of the United States borders. That was one of the things, the Remain in Mexico policy that started under the last president.
And I'm sure those camps that in Mexico, I'm sure they're awful. Again, every time you focus on the problem, so many things are awful. The gang violence in those other countries is awful. Domestic violence that women
well, the camps in this country were awful. There was all sorts of sexual abuse and allegations of violence of all sorts from some of the officials that were supposed to be helping to keep them cool.
Biden took the other view. When he ran against Trump, he took the other view. But, I think that he says in the debate, I'm big enough to learn from policy issues, and this one didn't work out. It was with the best of intentions, but it didn't work out. And now I've come up with a new policy, which does help with this. The Republicans aren't helping me at all, but I'm fighting this problem. They talk a good game, the Republicans, but all they want to do is talk.
Sure. I mean, this bill that they really wanted and crafted in large measure, it had money for additional lawyers and for additional ways to process many of those people wanting legal asylum, or at least to be heard on immigration and make it legal. The reality is it was derailed because they wanted to make it a political football, which it continues to be. David, I love
Mark, one last thing. I have admiration for the attorneys who help them. I have great admiration for these NGOs. They had a story about San Diego where these volunteers work around the clock to try to get them into some kind of social, some shelters or something else like that. But you can't fight it alone with a couple of NGOs. The country needs a big immigration bill that both parties sign on. And some of these problems really can be ameliorated. But, the Republicans just want to run on this issue. And I think Biden needs to point that out. And I think he's going to rally on this issue and rally in general. I'm looking forward to the debate.
I haven't done this in a while, but ameliorated, I have to give it a ding. Thank you very much. David, I loved your segment on the East Coast Midnight Show, says Michael D. Was that WABC crazy cage match that they throw you into? Is that what that is, David?
But, they hear your side of the story. And I thought that, I thought they really heard what I had to say. And it was great. And the main point of it, Mark, really, really briefly, was that the DA's office did do a good job. They presented a good case, and the other person the Trump person had to pretty much admit, well, I never liked it from the beginning. It was political in the sense that it was selective prosecution of Trump. But at the end of the day, he had no criticisms about the trial, and he had no criticisms about the fact that if that body man had really helped, the 96-second call, if that had really been just with the body man talking about a 14-year-old stalker, call the body man to the stand. Didn't do that. They called one witness of any substance, Costello, and he blew up in their faces. The people had great cross-examination. They walked right into it, and they took it right on the chin, the Trump defense.
This is from Delwood. I think he's trolling me. Only David presents the reality instead of the make-believe asylum. Mark lives in a make-believe world of his definition of valid asylum. Mark would invite tens of millions to stay forever. Delwood, I'm actually on David Katz's side on this. You're just being an a-hole right now, Delwood Kelp. You don't even you're smearing me. How dare you, Delwood
How
Kelp?
dare he?
I am going to yellow card you right now, Delwood Kelp. You are yellow carded. You heard it.
Why are you yelling?
On Kim's birthday, Delwood Kelp is yellow carded. How dare he presume my position?
Mark, it makes me think of that song, You're Still Living in a Make-Believe World. What's that song?
That's right.
Maybe you'll grow. Come back, baby.
Come
Come back, baby. Whatever it was. Mark, you're not living in a make-believe world. You're living in the real world. And
Kim,
how about a shout-out for Mark? Mark,
yeah, how about, by the way, it's Kim's birthday, David. We're very excited. We adore you, and we're...
Happy birthday to toi.
Thank you. I have a question for you as well.
Feliz cumple.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Muchas gracias.
Cumpleaños. Yay.
So I know that you're a Cal grad, and I don't know if you've been following what's going on at People's Park with the construction of new student housing and low-income housing, and a lot of people don't want this built. So there's been this legal battle, and today some breaking news comes out that the state Supreme Court says UC Berkeley can go ahead and build, basically deciding in the university's favor. Any thoughts on this case at all?
When Reagan was in power, they couldn't build on People's Park, and now we have Newsom and they can build on the People's Park. I don't know. I never followed it that closely, but it was a cause célèbre in Berkeley. I was trying to get that great taxpayer subsidized education that I got at Berkeley undergrad and at law school. So I walked around all these things. My whole goal was to get my education and not get involved in a lot of this turmoil, because it's just 98% of the people, like at UCLA right now or at Berkeley when I went there, they want to get this great education. And so it's funny when we have these reputations. I teach people at SC. It's like, wow, SC is going to be known as the people, because that's what people know about Berkeley, right? They know about the free speech movement and
Right.
People's Park. And I always say, by the time I went there, which is like, a few years after the free speech movement, I said that we would only demonstrate if the recruiters didn't come to campus. So I'm not the best person to ask. I worked for some great professors. I worked for the one who wrote the Panama Canal Treaty. I had all these wonderful, to work with. I know it was, and he was a German. He was also a refugee from the Nazis. He got out when he was still a professor. Professor Riesenfeld. He was the fellow who wrote the Panama Canal Treaty. Didn't negotiate it, but somebody has to actually write the text and figure out what we can do about this thing. He wrote the text, and he was just great. He actually had gotten me into the State Department under Carter, but I did my clerkship in Washington D.C. By the time my clerkship was over, by now it was like early '82. Reagan had lost my application. He lost my acceptance letter.
Oh my God.
But that's what I really wanted to be. I wanted to work for the legal advisor to the State Department, and I had this mentor and sponsor, this Professor Riesenfeld from Berkeley. So for me, it was a chance to, when in the world can you work with somebody like that? You go to Harvard or Berkeley or something like that, and you work with people like that. And so honestly, the demonstrations weren't that interesting. But can I tell you one last story? When I applied to federal judges, I dropped all of my applications into the mailbox at the same time. It got firebombed before my applications went out. So a third of my applications to judges, federal judges, didn't ever get there. A third of them kind of got there okay, and a third of them got there singed. And I got interviewed by a couple of judges. I don't know if they were interested in me, but I think they were interested in how the hell did this guy send me an application that was half singed, but I could still read it.
You mean firebombed at mailboxes on the Cal campus?
Yeah. You dropped it in an old-fashioned post box right near campus. And I dropped them all in. So, it was, like I said, most people who went there, were just really into, learning and their careers. And so places like Berkeley, and I think, I hear about the some of the Jewish students at these campuses, and I know it was awful, some of the stuff that they were subjected to.
Sure.
But my glib reaction was, well, as soon as you hear the bullhorn, walk around the noise, like we did at Berkeley. Walk all around the noise and go to study with the fellow who is the legal advisor to President Carter.
Yeah.
Did you? Was the Marquise being a roadie for the Marquise after that?
Marquez.
Sorry, Marquez. Marquez. They were Marquez were like the band that played with Isaac Hayes, that played with Wilson Pickett, played with all the great Otis Redding, all these great artists. Now, when was that? Before Berkeley?
Oh, yeah. The Barkays were summer and fall of '69.
Okay.
I was very young. Those are the great old days when you were the age you put down on the application. Those days are gone forever. Those days are gone forever, Mark.
We love you. David Katz, thank you. We'll drop this as a separate video. A lot of love for you in the chat, and we appreciate all of your thoughts and analysis every week. Stay in touch, and we'll talk to you next week.
Happy birthday. Feliz cumpleaños, Kim.
Yeah, Kim.
Thank you.
David Katz, everybody. Come on. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.